Welcome, everyone. This is our next session in our Ciclo Internacional Criminología UCT. Today, we have a very special guest from France, Paul Rocher, who is going to talk about his book, an amazing book. I was published like 2 months ago, Gazette Mutilaire Sommet, Les politiques de l'art non létal. Forgive my French, it's very bad, but Paul has agreed to talk about his book, about his work, and it's part of the cycle that we have been holding in Criminología OCT about the use of force, about the use of less lethal weapons and human rights violations. This book covers the history of less lethal weapons, the recent history. He also talked about what happened in France and not only in France, but in several other parts of the world. So basically, I'm very thankful or grateful for Paul to accept to be with us today. And well, Paul, welcome.
Well, thanks, Javier, for this invitation. I'm very glad to be invited to your seminar. I'm very grateful that you allow me to expose my research to an international public and to a public from Chile. So I think we'll start right away. So I'll share my screen. Okay. So I can do this. So you can see it now. Is it okay?
Yes, we can
Great.
see it.
Okay, so this is my first presentation in English of this book. So, well, a bit of an exciting moment. So, as Javier just introduced me, I just repeated quickly. So I'm Paul Rocher. I'm an economist, and I wrote a book called Gazer, Mutiler, Soumettre, Politique de l'arme non létale, on basically crowd control and non-lethal weapons. I also put my Twitter account here, so in case you want to follow me or exchange information, just go there. And without speaking more about myself, I'll start right away talking about this book. And I think that the initial motivation for writing this book is something, an experience which is pretty similar to what you have experienced recently in Chile as well, which is that you have massive social unrest, demonstrations, people on the streets, but you do not only have people on the streets, but there is also many injured people. So what is specific of the current period, I think it seems, is that many people get hurt when demonstrating. So I put some photos here. The first one in the upper left side is, of course, a photo of France, the yellow jackets, the gilets jaunes, which was kind of an initial motivation for me to write this book, or more precisely, when this happened, I was actually already writing this book. So it just gave me more input for that book. So that was something that was really impressive and provided me with lots of data. But the interesting thing is that this is not only a French phenomenon. So I put some other photos. You have on the bottom right side, there's that's a video from the New York Times recently, where the New York Times has produced a video about how federal officers escalated violence in Portland. And then on the bottom left side, this is a screenshot from the session with Scott Reynolds that you organized as well, Javier, which shows the number of non-lethal weapons used in Chile and Hong Kong. So basically, as I saw, you also have the same issue of social unrest and many injured and even maimed persons. So that was like the initial input for writing this book. Here I have present you some data about the number of injured people in France. The interesting thing is that there is no official data provided by the French state about the people that got injured during demonstrations. So these data comes from a journalist called David Dufresne, who was documenting all the people injured by police force. And what is very important here is that, I mean, it's in French, but the important figures, I'll give you them. I give you these figures right away. Well, you have 5 people that got their hand torn apart. You have almost 30 people that got blinded by mostly kinetic impact projectiles, and I think this is a big issue also in Chile. Then we had more than 300 people with injuries on their head, and we also had some dead people. So you see, once you have this data, this of course makes you think about what is actually the tool that allowed so many people to get hurt during demonstrations. And this is what brought me to the non-lethal weapons. And I just put this image from a recent article on Chile, which illustrates that that you have the same problem of kinetic impact projectiles, and even I believe on a more massive scale than in France. So what I got interested in was the tools, the police weapons. So the weapons that I used for these massive injuries. And in my book, I started from something that the French philosopher Simone Weil wrote, which is pretty interesting, I think, because she said that the most effective method possible is to evaluate every war in terms of the ends pursued and not by the nature of the means employed. So of course, I'm not talking about war, but I'm talking about weapons. And still, I think this is something which is kind of counterintuitive, because the first thing you would do if you see that police is shooting at crowds is asking, why are they doing this? But if you really want to understand how a weapon works and how the weapon impacts also the one that is shooting, you need actually to dig a bit more into the specificities of the means employed, so of the specificities of the weapon. So what she said is that what you need to understand is the consequences necessarily implied by the working of the means employed. So you need really to focus on the means. So that's what I tried to do in, let's say, the first part of my book. And this brought me to one major argument, which is that instead of ensuring a more human crowd control, non-lethal weapons actually entail its brutalization. I guess it's similar in Chile, because that's more or less the same idea all around the world, which is states say we introduce non-lethal weapons because they allow us to be more human, to have a softer crowd control. And actually what happens is exactly the contrary. So that my argument is that non-lethal weapons actually produce a more brutal crowd control, and I'll explain that in a minute. And the second argument of my book, which is more or less the second part of the book, is that weapons do not just fall from the sky. They are part of a political project, and through historical investigation, I tried to show that basically, if we have a rise in non-lethal weapons today, it's because these weapons correspond to the neoliberal social order. That's at least what I found for France, and we can discuss this also, and discuss the extent to which it also could apply to the case of Chile or other countries. So the idea, my starting point here is that I'm really interested in the way non-lethal weapons shape the behavior of police forces. So I tried to understand what happened, how do police forces react or behave differently once they are equipped with non-lethal weapons. And why did I do this? Because I found that there was something unsatisfactory in the public debate in France, because as I told you, as I showed you, we had many injured people, and at some point the media got interested in the topic of non-lethal weapons, but the debate mainly revolved around the legality of shooting a rubber bullet, of the proportionality of, shooting tons of tear gas on demonstrators, or the necessity of just giving loads of baton hits to demonstrators. So the debate was basically about the legal framework of police violence. And here on the right side, you can see the United Nations Human Rights Committee guide on non-lethal weapons, and they insist on the fact that police using force is only legal if it respects the criteria of proportionality and necessity. But I think we need to go beyond that debate, and I'll tell you in a minute why we should go beyond. Before telling you why we should go beyond that debate, I would just give you the official definition of the non-lethal weapon, which I use throughout my book and also throughout this presentation. And so according to Neil Davison's book on non-lethal weapons, I think it was published in 2009, or was it 2004? I don't remember, but he gives the definition, and actually in France is exactly the same, which is the non-lethal weapons are those weapons that are intended to incapacitate people without causing death or permanent injury. So that's the point. And what Davison also outlines at the beginning of his book is that basically the terms of non-lethal, of less lethal, are basically the same. So initially governments started telling people that they would use non-lethal weapons. Then, against the background of massive violence that also led to permanent injuries, government said, okay, maybe these weapons are not non-lethal, but they are less lethal. But still, the debate revolves around the technical characteristics of the weapon. Whereas I argue, and this brings me back to the next point, whereas I argue that actually it's not enough to look on the technical characteristics of a weapon, because a weapon is not just a neutral tool. A weapon is always used by somebody, and a weapon shapes the behavior of somebody. And this brings me back to the point where I said I think we need to go beyond the debate about the legality of non-lethal weapons, because if we talk about the legality, well, we would have an investigation about, was the use of violence legitimate in this specific case or that specific case, which is of course a very important activity, because it would because it can allow people to receive justice. But I think there is a bigger phenomenon going on behind all these individual cases, and I think the bigger problem is what I try to identify in my book. So I try to go beyond the idea of individual mistakes in order to outline the underpinning logic of violence that brought us into a situation where police is shooting more and more with non-lethal weapons. Recently, I found this graph from the Agence France Presse, which is like a French press agency, but they also publish stuff in English because they want to do international press agency work. And they produced this little image with different less lethal weapons, as they call it. And what I found interesting is that now, indeed, there is debate about the fact that actually so-called less lethal weapons can be lethal, so that they are actually lethal weapons. But the image tells you that for each of the weapons, actually serious injury or death can only be caused in case of misuse. So the problem is not the weapon as such, but it's the way policemen use it. So you have some individual policemen that make the mistake of misusing the weapon. And I think it's not enough to just question the misuse of individual policemen. What we need to do is to question the logic that the equipment of policemen by non-lethal weapons implies. And interestingly, the source of this graphic are three producers of non-lethal weapons. So of course they have a commercial interest in telling that their weapon actually is good. It's just that sometimes policemen use them in a wrong way and this causes injury. But don't worry, as such the weapon is of course in a perfect state and you can use it. So the first thing I did in my book is to dig into the history of non-lethal weapons. And this history allows you to understand something pretty important, which is that anytime governments perceive that there is a crisis of maintaining social order, they look for technical solutions. So if they don't want to change their politics, they try to find a means to put down protests and demonstrations. And the history of non-lethal weapons basically started in Europe at the beginning of the 20th century, when there was the labor movement on the rise. And it was actually in France that tear gas was invented in 1911, 1912. So it was first supposed to be a weapon for the repression of the labor movement. But then, of course, the First World War happened, and from a weapon designed to repress the labor movement in France, tear gas went into becoming a weapon in war. So the French army used tear gas against the German army. Then 1 year later, the German army developed its own tear gas and used it again. And when in 1917 the US joined the First World War, they also triggered their own research program on tear gas. And actually, the soldiers from the First World War had a very bad souvenir of tear gas. So this actually somehow delegitimized tear gas. So, there were thousands of soldiers having bad memories of tear gas. So this pushed states actually to prohibit tear gas in the use of war. So there was this Geneva Protocol in 1925 prohibiting tear gas in war. But this, of course, did not imply that tear gas would be also prohibited for colonies. So the colonial management, of course, was then the next step, where tear gas was used massively. And the idea behind was the following. It was that to the extent that there were increasingly revolts by the colonized people, the colonizers had to find a weapon that, does not trigger massive massacres. So if you shoot, if the British army shoots 300 protesting Indians, this might be likely to trigger even more protests. So that's why the colonial administrations found that tear gas would be a very efficient solution, because actually, it allows a repression without being that visible. So this was basically the first period of non-lethal weapons, it's the introduction of tear gas. Then you have a second period, which is the 1960s and 1970s, mainly in Western Europe and the United States, where you have in the US the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, you have the students movement and labor movement in many countries. And as there was like pretty much of social unrest, again, governments tried to, handle the situation by using or by introducing new non-lethal weapons. That's the moment where plastic and rubber bullets were invented at the end of the 1960s. And that was also the moment where electrical weapons were developed for the first time. I can go into the details of all of these different weapons and the different moments, but the main point is that there was a second point in the history of the 20th century where social order was being challenged, which was the end of the 1960s and the beginning of the 1970s, and the response from governments to this challenge was not to give in, change their politics, but change their policy, but their solution was to look for new weapons that would be more efficient in repressing social movements. And then the last moment, which is the moment in which we are living now, started in the 1990s. The peculiarity of this moment is that at that point, the historical challenger of the established order, which was the labor movement, was pretty weak, and so actually there was no real fundamental challenge to the current social order. But what changed at this point is that states actually got less tolerant towards social unrest, and that's the reason why in the 1990s they started to do new research on rubber bullets, on different kinds of grenades. And this story actually started in the United States in 1991 when a black man was hit by police officers, which is a rather banal scene of police racism. But the different thing at the point was that this scene where actually this black man was hit by police officers, and also he got two taser shocks, so two electrical pistol shots. This scene was filmed, and this film was distributed and shared among people, and this triggered the revolts of Los Angeles in 1992. And this was, of course, a challenge to the established order, but it was not a fundamental challenge to the, as was, for example, the labor movement, which was like, which is an organized movement challenging the social order. The revolts of Los Angeles were more of like a spontaneous riot, but still. The conclusion that governments and police in the United States drew from this episode is that they need to develop new, more efficient, non-lethal weapons. So the history of non-lethal weapons is basically the history of states perceiving a crisis of the social order and trying to respond to that order by searching for more efficient means for repression. So their intention is not to ensure a more human crowd control. What they're looking for is more efficient crowd control. And that's why they introduced ever more dangerous and ever more diverse weapons. So here you see what happened in France since the 1990s. As I said, there's a greater variety of weapons, and these weapons are ever more dangerous, ever more powerful. So there's, increasing danger. So what you see here is that, at the beginning of the 1990s, the French police had basically a water cannon, they had tear gas grenades, and they had their classical batons. This changed in 1995 when the first rubber bullet pistol was introduced, which is called the flashball. Some years later, a new version of this rubber bullet pistol was introduced. And then the sting grenade, the electroshock pistol, then again a more powerful rubber bullet pistol, which is called LBD-40, and then again another type of tear gas grenade, which is also explosive, so which is also like a fragmentation grenade. So what you have basically since the 1990s is that the police is equipped with new, more powerful weapons, and they have been introduced gradually. And since the 2010s, basically the different police units of crowd control have all these different weapons. And what happened at the same time is a massive increase of shots on the civil population. So here you have a graph that shows you the different kinds of weapons, so the electroshock pistol, the rubber bullets, and so on. And it shows you for every year between 2009 and 2018 the number of shots for each type of weapon. And what you see is actually a massive increase. You see, and I forgot to mention, these data are provided by the French states, but the data is very incomplete. For example, if you look at the line of the tear gas grenade at the very bottom, well, in 2015, they just stopped counting it. And for 2018, I just added the number of tear gas grenades that the police used on one single day, which is a day at the beginning of December in 2018. So these numbers massively underestimate actually the real situation. The same thing holds for the explosive tear gas grenade, which is actually generally not counted. So I had to add this grenade. But even with this incomplete data, what you see is a massive rise. So if you compare the total number of shots of different non-lethal weapons, if you compare the situation of 2009 with the situation of 2018, what you see is a multiplication by 9. And what is particularly striking here is that if you compare the rubber bullets, well, in 2009, we had 40 rubber bullet shots. And in 2018, you had more than 19,000. So here you have an increase, which is pretty striking. You have a multiplication by 480. So what you see here is actually a constant increase of shots on the civil population. And what you need to know is also that we have statistical data on the extent to which the civil population might be violent. And actually what we see from that data is that demonstrations did not become more violent in France. The only actor of crowd control that became more violent is the police, and they became massively more violent. And here you have the same graph, but it doesn't include the data for 2018, because if you look at the former data here, which includes the data of 2018, you almost get the impression that almost nothing happened until 2017 and 2018. Whereas if you exclude the 2018 data, you see already an important rise. So how can we explain this phenomenon? Well, the thing is, that's my argument, is that if you suggest to policemen that basically the weapon that they are using is not really dangerous, is non-lethal, cannot produce any permanent injury, well, then this, to a certain point, deresponsabilizes them. It's like, moral hazard. As long as you are not accountable of the costs of your action, well, you just act as you please. And that's basically what happens with non-lethal weapons. So from the point of where you suggest that these weapons are not dangerous, well, the thing is that, of course, policemen will use them and increasingly use them. And the thing that is not mentioned neither is that actually the producers of non-lethal weapons emphasize that their weapons are non-lethal under specific conditions. And for rubber bullets, at least for the French type of rubber bullets, the situation is pretty striking because what are the conditions for non-lethality? Basically, they imagine a situation where you have a policeman and you have a demonstrator. Neither of them is moving, so the policeman has perfect visibility on his target. He has enough time to think and target the person, and then he can shoot. But these conditions, you know, they are not matched by reality. In reality, you have, you know, very bad visibility because police is shooting tear gas grenades at the same time. Policemen are moving, demonstrators are moving, so there's the risk of shooting at the wrong person. And of course, if a person knows that he or she is targeted, it will move. So the policeman won't be able to target the person that easily. And of course, there's stress in the real situation. So actually, all the conditions that according to the producer make the weapon non-lethal are not fulfilled in reality. And you can, you know, play the same scenario for other weapons, but still, the police force is told that these weapons are not dangerous, they are non-lethal, and so of course they shoot as they please. And there's also evidence that policemen enjoy shooting at people. I can dig into these details a little bit later, but the basic thing is here that by suggesting non-lethality, you actually increase or you encourage policemen to use these weapons, and that's how we get into a situation where you have hundreds of people injured, maimed, or even dead. And then there's, as I said at the beginning, there is, of course, Javier mentioned it. You know, people are not stupid. They know that they are subject to, you know, dangerous weapons, and they prepare. They learn from one demonstration to the other that, well, if you come without any protection, then you will be exposed and your health will be in danger. So what people increasingly do, at least that's what I observed in France, is that they equip themselves with like masks, with goggles, with, I don't know, scarves, helmets, and that they have like also their banners, which they use to protect them against police shooting. So people react to police violence, so they come increasingly equipped. And one thing that also happened then in France is that policemen increasingly started to confiscate all this protective material, or even worse, put people in detention, because police force said, well, if you are equipped, this means that you have bad intentions. That means that you're a violent demonstrator. And so we put you in detention, and you might even get sued. So this is was like a way the police tried to, you know, compensate the fact that people are equipping themselves and thereby reduce the impact of non-lethal weapons. And there's even, I mentioned a police report in the book from the French police that says that, well, if people come equipped, well, then our weapons will be much less efficient. So we need to keep people from coming with their own equipment. And so people get actually criminalized for protecting their health. But still, the fact is that the question of health during demonstrations then became a political issue. People said, well, you do not give us any other choice than coming with protection, because you keep shooting at us all the time, and so we just have to react to that. And interestingly, from the politicization of injuries, then there was another step. that was made in France recently, where also the police weapons get politicized, and this is how the issue of disarming the police became also an issue in France. At the beginning, I said, and now I skip to my second argument. At the beginning, I said that of course weapons do not just fall from the sky; they are part of a political project. So in the first part of my presentation and in the first part also of my book, I tried to dig into the specificities of non-lethal weapons and showed that they increase police brutality. And in the second part, I tried to analyze a bit the political project in which the non-lethal weapons are used. So this is a bit, my economist coming back to the fore and trying to explain what happened in the political economy of France in the last 30-40 years in order to make non-lethal weapons so popular. And I don't know to what extent this also sticks to situation to the political and economic situations in countries of the global south, but at least in Europe, it's pretty clear that you had the introduction of neoliberalism, which went hand in hand with an increase of social inequality and reduced social rights. And this is, of course, these are promising conditions for social unrest. And then the governments tried, to anticipate how to handle this unrest, and their response basically was to introduce non-lethal weapons. So instead of trying to handle a potentially socially explosive situation with non-violent techniques of conflict management, they really said, no, we need more police weapons, more non-lethal weapons for our repression. And here I have public data from France relating to public spending on police weapons. So you have different kinds of police weapons. You have handguns, you have non-lethal weapons, you have submachine guns, and you have assault rifles. And basically the striking fact is that for this short period, only between 2012 and 2017, there was a massive increase of non-lethal weapons, which were actually the category of weapons that increased the most. So it increased by 75%. So what we have here is that the French state is really massively buying new weapons, which tells us that it is actively preparing for violent repression. This is one thing, and of course, then you have producers that provide these weapons, and so I also have one chapter on the non-lethal weapons industry. I mean, there's part of it is international, part of it is focused on France, but one very significant thing is that if you look at market studies, like 5 years ago, these studies said, well, there is a massive potential for selling non-lethal weapons in Southeastern Asia and in some authoritarian countries a bit all around the world. So this was like, these were the target markets for producers of non-lethal weapons. And in the meantime, since 2016, 17, 18, the situation has completely changed. Now, according to market studies, the whole world is a potential market and a fast-growing market for the manufacturers of non-lethal weapons. And this also explains why the stock index for non-lethal weapons, has shows very high growth rates. So this index is growing every year by roughly 10%, whereas generally economic growth is much lower. So this tells us that actually non-lethal weapons is really a very promising industry, and that states, countries are increasingly spending public money on these weapons, which of course tells us that for the coming years, we can expect more violent crowd control, more injured people, even though of course people try to organize the self-defense against these weapons, but still the significant fact is that to the extent that that governments are unwilling to change their policy, they keep increasing inequalities, and then in case there is social unrest, well, they are prepared to react by police brutality, by using non-lethal weapons, and then we have this vicious circle. But maybe I'll stop here and go into details later if you wish to do so.
Okay, sorry. Thank you very much. Wow. It's very interesting what you have said. And I found very striking parallels to what we have been seeing here in Chile and what we have seen in other places. So, well, we have a few people with us today, and I want to know if anyone have any questions for initiate a dialogue. I have one or two questions of my own, but I want to know if any of our guests want to start this dialogue with Paul.
I could make a comment or question.
Yes, go ahead, please.
Well, thank you very much, Paul, for your excellent presentation and for your generosity on sharing the main arguments containing your book. Thanks also, Javier, for organizing this conversation. I find that there are many interesting aspects on your work, Paul. I really like your emphasis on the means and putting the focus on weapons like as the important thing to around which to put our attention. Also the expressive and symbolic dimensions of the use of specific weapons. And along with this, I'm also very interested on your thoughts about what you call the underpinning logic of violence or the underlying political project that could be behind the expansion of the use of less lethal weapons. And I would like you to ask if you could like maybe talk a little bit more about that second point. I mean the underlying political project, and maybe try to ask you if you would argue that there is something like a authoritarian turn that could be linked to neoliberal regimes. I think you suggested something like that, and to which extent you would say that argument has a strong explanatory force. And I ask this because if I think that's a very interesting argument for the case of France and maybe also for the case of Chile and many countries in our region. But if you look to other examples, maybe that analysis could lose some force. I'm thinking about cases like the recent protest in Belarus, where we saw a massive use of less lethal weapons. And in that case, police forces are not precisely enforcing the neoliberal order, right? So to which extent you would say that there is a certain authoritarian turn linked to neoliberal rationale that could be identified as the main explanation for the expansion of the use of less lethal weapons. I don't know if the question is clear or not, but I just found interesting that point, and maybe you could say a little bit more about it.
Paul?
Can I respond? Okay. Thanks very much for. Do you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks very much for these challenging questions. So just a short statement on the underpinning logic of violence. So my idea is that the logic which we see now with non-lethal weapons is exactly that. To the extent that these weapons are presented as not dangerous, they encourage the use, and I think that's the underpinning logic of violence. So it's not that much the individual policeman that is brutal. Also, this is of course also an issue and should not be underestimated. But there's a more general phenomenon which induces policemen to become more violent as soon as they are equipped with non-lethal weapons, and this makes crowd control by non-lethal weapons increasingly brutal and dangerous, and yeah, that's the idea. On the second aspect of the aspect of the political project, my starting point for understanding this was an idea expressed by Antonio Gramsci, who said that basically hegemony is like the combination of force and consent. So you have to mix consent and force, and according to the different historical periods, one of these two ingredients is more important than the other, even though modern states are of course built on the monopoly of physical violence, so the potential of violence is always there. And then the thing is that if a state presents itself as violent, if it is perceived as violent by its own population, then this, even though it does not directly lead to challenging the legitimacy of the states as such, it is bad news for the government. So it reduces the popularity of a government. And in order to avoid this, I think the governments increasingly started to buy non-lethal weapons, hoping thereby that they can, exert repression while staying popular, because they can tell everybody, well, what are you complaining about? These weapons are not dangerous. And you have also this vocabulary that is around these non-lethal weapons. I mean, the term non-lethal is an example of such, but actually all the different kinds of weapons that there are in France, they have a very nice name. They do not sound very violent. So all of this suggests that finally states are not violent. And why is it important to not be perceived as violent for the state? That's because, and here we come back to the history of capitalism. The thing is that you had this neoliberal shift in the 1970s, 1980s. In Chile, it was, of course, a case that is very different from the neoliberal shift that we had in Europe. But this shift, was not only a shift in distributing wealth from the poor to the rich, but it also actually changed the groundings of the modern state. How do we see these changes? Well, these changes, you see them, for example, in France, at least, it's pretty well documented that the parliament plays a less important role. They only vote general laws, which are then filled with concrete content by the administration. So the administration gets more impact on actually policy making. At the same time, the executive branch of the state is increasing its power. Police is getting more important and becoming less accountable. Then what we have more recently is also that an increasing number of demonstrations are prohibited in France, that an increasing number of individuals are kept from participating in demonstrations on a preventive basis. So not because they did something against the law, but because the state suspects them of doing something. So actually this is also a change in the state of law, which is happening. And so you have you know, an array of different elements suggesting indeed that there is an authoritarian turn. I mean, I developed that in a more detailed manner in the book, but I think that there is also a general debate that I know it at least in Europe about the authoritarian turn. And then the example of Belarus is pretty interesting, because indeed I said that a transformation towards a more authoritarian state goes hand in hand with neoliberalism. And then you said, well, but Belarus, well, how does that stick into your example? And actually there was that example is pretty interesting, because if you look at Belarus, what is striking, because I recently read a pretty comprehensive economic report on the situation of Belarus in 2016, the striking thing is that inequalities, for example, are less important in Belarus than they are in France. And the inequalities actually, you know, are on this low level. And if you compare it to Chile, the Gini index in Chile is extremely high. And so in Belarus, strangely, well, of course, they were into this general tendency towards neoliberalism. There was, you know, workers' rights got reduced through the last years, but still, actually, there was the growth that was happening in Belarus was rather redistributive. And I think the current situation is also triggered by the fact that this mechanism now doesn't work anymore, because support from Russia is not that important now. But it's true that, I mean, what does that say us about the use of non-lethal weapons in Belarus? I cannot give you a definitive answer on the political use or the political project that is behind the use of non-lethal weapons. But nonetheless, I think the striking thing is that still, as in any other country right now, also the police in Belarus was shooting, you know, like a lot.
Thank you. Does anyone has want to make a question? Okay, I have a comment for myself. I found very interesting what you have told us. And something that we have discovered in our own research in Chile is we have detected like 4 moments in the way that the government and the police deploy less lethal weapons in Chile. In 2012, they make a ballistic test to know how dangerous these weapons, like the rubber buckshot that they were using here, how dangerous they were. In 2012, police knew that at less than 30 meters, this ammunition was lethal. And they also knew that between 30 meters and 15 meters, that was like the safe distance. They knew that because it was backshots, the dispersion, like the different projectiles will actually spread. And therefore, they knew then that this was a very bad ammunition to use against group of people, because there was a high chance that they could actually hurt innocent people. They knew this in 2012. This report was secret, and we only knew about it because in November 2019, it was leaked for the press. So there was one moment when they knew what this ammunition could do. Then in 2012 and 13, and then in 2019, they produced regulations. And they tell to everyone in this country that those weapons and those ammunition were non-lethal. They never incorporated in those regulations the safe distance, or for example, they did not incorporate in this regulation that police should not aim to the upper part of the body. So there was one second moment. So they knew the dangers of it. Then when they had to regulate for the police to know how to use it, at least for the public, they tell us that they were non-lethal, despite the fact that they knew they were potentially lethal. The third moment was on October of last year, when someone, I don't know who, decided that this ammunition should be used against people that was protesting. And then finally, we have the last moment when the individual policemen were using them. And of course, I agree with you that when you tell policemen that they are going to use non-lethal weapons, they may become trigger happy. I think you used that phrase in your book. But then 2 weeks ago, one policeman was prosecuted by the Chilean prosecution service. Even though that the police regulation were actually bad, like the charges, the prosecution tell us that this individual, that this former police officer, used the weapon in such a way that it make it more dangerous than what it was. And it's incredible because, like, when we start making the questions about the criminal liability, like, where is this criminal liability? Like, of course, there is this individual that fired the weapon, but also we start making questions about, like, police command, or even the government that is actually telling to the citizens that are using non-lethal weapons that they know that they can be lethal. And the big issue that we have had in Chile is that every time that we have take police to court, asking the courts to forbid the munitions because they are dangerous, because we have the technical evidence, as you mentioned, the court says, oh, but there are regulations. The police has regulation, but we make the complaint. They said those regulations are not technical, but the court has refused to look to the technical evidence. I think that in France you have a similar problem. I think that the court has refused to ban. I don't know if the flashball or the LBD, but it makes sense, like, to try to understand this from a more biopolitical perception. Now, so what would you suggest? Like, what we should do in terms of, like, we should actually ban these weapons? We should look for more regulations. What are your views on what, like, people like that are studying and making activism on this area should do? What we should actually aim for? A complete for ban of all these weapons in the context of protest, or can we trust that some of these weapons will eventually be safe? How do you what will your suggestions, or what do you think that we should do, or we should aim to achieve?
Good question as well. Well, the story that you just told us is pretty striking, because obviously they knew then they had regulations, but that actually do not really tackle the problem, but actually authorize the use of weapons. And then you cannot even, use the contradiction, the fundamental problem in court. So that this situation seems pretty stuck to me. I think that, I mean, and something similar happened in France, because until 2014, there was a regulation that prohibited rubber bullet shots from a distance below 10 meters. But this regulation then was skipped, and so there is no more safety minimal distance, so it doesn't exist anymore, which is, again, as you said, paradoxical, because this minimal distance is one of the criteria to ensure non-lethal shots. But more generally, I think that because the availability of non-lethal weapons propels policemen to shoot. I think that with more regulations, you cannot really come close to ensuring a safer situation. So in my point of view, the only thing that you can do to make public life safer and to ensure the fundamental liberty of expression is to prohibit different kinds of non-lethal weapons. And I mean, the most striking cases, of course, rubber bullets, and the ones that you have in Chile, which are really, tiny bullets. Well, they are specifically dangerous, even more dangerous than those that are used in France, which are already dangerous. But I think the same thing also applies to tear gas, for example. There's a colleague in France, or even an association, gathering biologists, chemists, and doctors who are currently trying to study the effects of tear gas and also the long run effects, and their results are pretty frightening. So even this weapon also actually should be prohibited as it stands now. So I think, given that these weapons induce policemen to shoot more, I think the only way to make things safer is to prohibit them. And I think there is a second advantage in prohibiting these weapons, in disarming the police, which is that this would push governments to actually politically deal with problems. Because it's not because you shoot at a population that is demonstrating against a rise in public transport fares or anything else that you solve the problem. The problem will appear a little later again. So I think disarming the police is also, from this point of view, a question of democracy, because it pushes governments to deal politically with social unrest. And from this point of view, it would, maybe also signal a bit of a pushback of the authoritarian turn. So I think that's the only solution that we have currently. And I mean, the argument that I see is that you show them the statistical data, because of course that should not prevent you from suing the state in specific cases where somebody got blinded or when somebody lost his hand or something else, where you insist on the specific circumstances under which a policeman used the weapon. But I think if we look at the bigger picture, a general prohibition of these non-lethal weapons seems necessary to me.
Thank you. Well, I want to invite any of other guests if they have any question. Daniela, Isabel, Yasmir, Sebastian. Oh, sorry, there seems to be a question. Okay, Paul, can you see the chat? There is a question for you. Like, hi everyone, I'm in a loud space, so cannot mute. Paul, thank you that was so informative. Can you speak to the difference between crowd control by police and the use of non-lethal weapons by the military of occupying forces, such in Kashmir and Palestine? Does the designation of occupation have a specificity to its different from the legal designation of usage during war? And second, and relatedly, I wonder if you might expand your mention of Global South locations and the difference or similarities with your work in France.
Oh, again, a very challenging question. Well, the first thing is that my study is on, domestic crowd control. So I did not much dig into the situations of Palestine or Kashmir, but I think I can say a couple of things though. What is pretty striking is that, I mean, if you look at the history of non-lethal weapons, then you see that Palestine was administered by the British colonial empire. Then there was the creation of Israel, and the Israeli army was one of the first also to massively use rubber bullets, and the interesting thing is also that then, the army was asked, why do you have so many injuries and even dead people by rubber bullets in so many dead Palestinians? And they basically said, well, we cannot really handle all the consequences of these non-lethal weapons. And what basically happened there as well is that once you equip your armed forces with non-lethal weapons, it encourages them to use them massively because anyway, they think that it's not really dangerous. And then we have the situation where actually, in Palestine, you have a very high number, not only of permanently injured people, but also dead. So, the thing is that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation that the 1925 Geneva Protocol prohibits tear gas in the framework of war, but it doesn't prohibit it in the use of crowd control. So in the case of crowd control, it's perfectly legal. And I think that's also the reason that maybe applies to Kashmir and Palestine, even though I'm not exactly sure about the legal situation. So maybe someone else can specify that. And finally, on the question of similarities and differences between France and the global South. Well, the first thing is that your history, the history of the global South, or its relation, this core periphery dynamics, produce a situation where neoliberalism did not come about in the same way as it did in the core countries. So because what basically happened is that you had a situation of dependency, which often went hand in hand with authoritarian governments, which for quite a while, did not hesitate to use so-called lethal weapons because they had to care a bit less about, their popularity because they really emphasized repression. But still, even that does not apply to all the southern countries. So it's difficult to make a general statement, but still, as it stands today, where you have like modern liberal states in the global South, I think the problem of non-lethal weapons is pretty similar to the one that we have in France. If you look, for example, the repression of the striking workers in Americana in South Africa in 2012, well, the thing was that there were many striking workers shot by police, but they were shot with non-lethal weapons. The same thing happened in Bahrain in 2011, 2012, in Egypt, in Tunisia. Repression was mainly exerted by non-lethal weapons. And I think from this point of view, now you have many similarities. And I also, draw a bit on the experience from Egypt and Bahrain in my book. So I think the problem of the increase of police brutality because of the availability of non-lethal weapons, this problem is now shared in all countries that are equipped with non-lethal weapons.
Thank you, Paul. Anyone has another question? You can make it on audio or leave it in the chat. I have another question, like with a colleague, for example, Isabel Severin that is here, and Pietro Esperanza that work in a different university. They are starting working with the concept of reparation. The Chilean government has acknowledged the fact that they have a large group of people that have been blinded. One report that I sent to you state that at least 182 people have lost at least the eyesight on one eye. And I know that in France you have had less numbers. I think that the last data that I saw, you have had around 50 to 60 people with ocular trauma between 2016 up to 2019. Has the government acknowledged the victims of this lethal weapon? Has they do anything for them in terms of offer them healthcare support? Because my partner said something very smart, and I haven't thought about it. My partner is Scottish. And he mentioned that in the actual context, In Chile, to be injured by the government, to lose your eyesight, it could be also constructed as an economical burden, because in Chile we don't have public health care, at least we don't have nothing like the National Health Service. Basically, the quality of the health service that you receive, it depends on the amount of money that you can pay. And if you can pay much money, then therefore you will have a low quality health service. So therefore, in this neoliberal context, to lose your sight is also some kind of economical cost or burden that you have to pay for having to use to exercise the right to protest against any kind of policy. So basically, in this context, the idea of reparation became very relevant. I don't know if you have, or in France, anything about how it happened with the victims.
Well, on individual cases, that it might be interesting to speak with one of the lawyers which are following these cases in France. I'm not aware of anyone getting reparation so far, but I'm not very much informed about what happens in courts. But the thing is that on the political scale, just recently the French president said, "Don't talk about repression. Don't talk about police brutality. France is a democracy, and by definition, a democracy is not brutal and is not violent with its own population because the population is ruling." So there is like a total ignorance of this issue. But I know of injured people that say basically, I mean, even though there is public health insurance in France and the general coverage of health insurance, the thing is that even with that, even if you get like proper health care, well, if you get shot in your head, then you have like a trauma, so you get like to a certain extent disabled, you have nightmares all the time. So even if you get proper health care, actually for many people, even if they do not get blinded, they have permanent problems, health problems that keep them from working, for example. So indeed, you have like an economic loss on your own individual level. You can even see it from a macroeconomic perspective that, well, if you have so many people injured and unable to work, well, that makes that much less of a workforce. But it's interesting that you address the issue of reparations, because I'm not aware of any kind of reparations being discussed now in France. So I'd be interested in hearing more about this and how you intend to calculate and justify the demands for reparations. But what I can tell you is that basically it's true that the phenomenon of blind people is not as massive as in Chile, but it's still an important phenomenon. So yeah, I'd be interested in learning more about this.
Sorry. We have another question. Daniela Mardones, she's in Edinburgh. She said, "Hello, thank you for this very interesting presentation. Thinking about the future, has the French government taken any measures or has plans to change the use and abuse of these weapons, or this is something that isn't in the agenda at all?"
Well, as I just said, the government is not even recognizing the existence of police brutality. So this is the first problem. And the second problem is that I showed you the data on the on public spending on non-lethal weapons, which is increasing very sharply. And these were data until 2017. And the government that we have since 2017 has also been ordering new weapons and actually even more dangerous weapons. So I think it's the same tendency is continuing. So there's no change at all. Or if something changes, then only for the worse, because they again bought new rubber bullet pistols, which can shoot the rubber bullets in a quicker manner than the current pistols. So I think there the situation is very clear that there are no changes emphasized. And something interesting is also, and with an aspect that you find if you dig into the history of non-lethal weapons, is that governments associate, their the Ministry of the Interior or the Army Ministry with writers, with like science fiction writers or with futurologists. So with people that are very creative, and they put like policemen and science fiction writers together to think about future weapons, new non-lethal weapons. So that's what the US is doing since the 1990s, and the French government has started a similar working group only last year. So the idea, the tendency is pretty clear. It is going towards more repression.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have time for one last question. If anyone want to make one. Anyway, I want to thank you very much for this, for being with us, for talking with us. I hope we can continue collaborating. And does anyone want to make one last question? You can write it on the chat. We have a few more, 5, 10 minutes more. If Paul wanted, allow this. No, so not what. Okay. Well, I want to thank everyone who has been watching. Everyone has been with us, and again, I want to thank the generosity of Paul to be with us today and discuss these important matters. And we'll continue with this as part of our agenda to try to promote the ban. Jasbir is wanted to also thank you, and she would like to send you a copy of her book. I'm going to make I'm going to give you both of you the contact by email. Okay, thank you very much.
Great, that's perfect. And thank you, Javier, for organizing this and for giving me the chance to speak in front of this public with all these challenging and interesting questions. And yes, I hope that our collaboration will continue. I enjoy and appreciate it very much.